American Top 40.
From Hollywood, it's a special week on American Top 40. I'm Shadoe Stevens, and this week marks the 50th anniversary of the Billboard Pop Singles Chart. We'll have special spotlight features and facts from 50 years gone by. Let's line them up and count them down. You're listening to American Top 40. I'm Shadoe Stevens, and now we're up to a special report on the Billboard Pop Singles Chart. Today it's known as the Hot 100, and this weekend is its 50th anniversary. Here's how it all began. Billboard magazine itself started publishing in 1894. Radio hadn't even been invented yet, and Thomas Edison had just invented the phonograph. So Billboard mostly covered live entertainment. They didn't print their first weekly music chart until 19 years later in 1913. And it wasn't the top-selling records. They charted the best-selling songs on sheet music. You see, in the days before TVs, VCRs, and Nintendo, people would buy sheet music to sing along at home or on the piano, and it wasn't uncommon for the sheet music of a song to sell 1 million copies. And then, by the 1930s, Billboard was ranking songs based on network radio airplay and jukebox popularity. And on the third week of July, 1940, Billboard published the very first national best-selling retail records chart. But it didn't cover 100 records, it only ranked the top 10. They based it on diaries, filled out by popular record shops in major cities that were then sent by wire to Billboard. Well, that chart gradually expanded to the top 30 records by the mid-1950s, and by November 1955, as record companies started releasing more and more singles, Billboard magazine was compelled to expand its rankings to a top 100. Now, that top 100 was based half on sales and half on airplay, and it's still that way today. Only two things have changed about that top 100, and they are the increase in the technology of gathering data and its name. In 1958, it became the Hot 100. And that's our special report on the Billboard Pop Singles Chart. The first one was 2,600 weeks ago, exactly 50 years.
American Top 40.
And now we're up to another of this week's special AT40 spotlights on the 50th anniversary of the Billboard chart. That chart began this week in 1940. And there have been hits by more than 4,600 recording acts. So who has charted the longest over the most years? Well, these are the top three. In third place is a man who Elvis Presley called the greatest singer of all. Last year, shortly after his death, he returned to the top 10 with You Got It. It was a chart span of 33 years for Roy Orbison. In second place is another great artist who last hit the chart years after his death. This trumpet player and singer hit the chart in 1988 with the song What a Wonderful World, and he'd first charted way back in 1949. With a chart span of over 38 and a half years, Satchmo, Louis Armstrong. And that leaves first place, the longest charting artist in Billboard pop singles history. And many singers will tell you he revolutionized pop singing with his phrasing, bridging the gap between crooners in the 1930s and everyone who followed. He turned 75 years old this year and was featured on the first Billboard #1 single in 1940 by the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, I'll Never Smile Again. And 40 years later, in 1980, he was still cranking out the hits with the song New York, New York. With an all-time record pop chart span of 40 years, he's Francis Albert Sinatra. Frank Sinatra. Definitely the chart chairman of the board. And that's our look at Billboard's longest charting artists on this week's 50th anniversary of the pop chart. You've tapped into the hit zone, American Top 40 with the Shadoe. And now, let's crank it up. Ah, yes, let's light the digital diodes across the board in the Wayback Machine for a full-flung voyage into the very heart of yesterday. We'll go spinning and sputtering through the vortex of time and tunes for a special AT40 flashback. We'll journey the musical mists way, way, way back to the year Nazi troops invaded Paris as France fell to Axis powers. And in the USA, the first American helicopter rolled off the assembly line. Bugs Bunny made his cartoon debut. A new Ford cost $700. A gallon of gas cost 18 cents. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented third term as president. It was 1940. And 50 years ago this week, Billboard magazine published its first pop singles chart, listing the top 10 records in the nation. And these were the top 5, from number 5 to number 1.
Fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Oh, playmate, come out and play with me and bring your dolly 3. Climb up my apple tree.
Imagination is funny. It makes a cloudy day sunny. The breeze and I are saying with a sigh, I'll never smile again. What good would it do?
And those were the top 5 songs on the very first Billboard chart of best-selling retail records 50 years ago this very week. At number 5, Fools Rush In by Glenn Miller and his orchestra. At number 4, Playmates by Kay Kaiser and his orchestra. At number 3, Imagination, also by Glenn Miller. At number 2, The Breeze and I by the Jimmy Dorsey Orchestra. And number 1 on the very first Billboard chart 50 years ago this week, I'll Never Smile Again by Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra, featuring a new 24-year-old singer named Frank Sinatra. And that's a special AT40 flashback to the very first weekly Billboard chart in 1940.
Around the world with a shadow.
It's American Top 40. I'm Shadoe Stevens, and now we're up to our final spotlight. On the 50th anniversary of the Billboard chart, they published that first pop singles chart 50 years ago this week. Back then, you could buy a pound of bread for 8 cents, and M&M candies were introduced. And since that very first chart in 1940, over 900 songs have hit number 1. 3 have spent 13 weeks at the top. 2 of those massive chart toppers came in the 1940s and spent 13 non-consecutive weeks at the top. They were Frenesy, an instrumental hit by Artie Shaw and his orchestra in 1940 and 1941. And in 1943, I've heard that song before by Harry James and his orchestra. And then there's the only song to have spent 13 straight weeks at number 1. It was first recorded by one of its writers while he was in prison. He was a folk singer named Huddie Ledbetter, but they called him Leadbelly. He recorded this song in the 1930s while he was serving time at a Louisiana prison for murder. It became a very popular prison song, and in 1950, a year after he died, Leadbelly's song hit number 1 and stayed there for 13 weeks.
Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams.
From 1950, that's Gordon Jenkins and the Weavers with Goodnight Irene. It became the number 1 song with the longest continuous stay at the top in Billboard's pop singles history. The only song in history to spend 13 consecutive weeks at number 1. And now, back to the countdown.